Hello, everyone. Dr. John Y. Rhee, MD, PhD, is a board-certified neuro-oncologist, neuro-oncologist, and palliative care specialist at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and instructor of neurology at Harvard Medical School, where he takes care of patients with brain cancer and their palliative care needs, and runs a supportive care research program for brain tumor patients. He was formerly chief resident of neurology at Mass General Brigham and received his MD PhD with distinctions in medical education, research, and global health from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, where he was a Dean Scholar in global health. He graduated with a BS in policy analysis with honors and distinction from Cornell University. He is a young member of the Pontifical Academy of Life, Vatican City, and is director and founder of the Piermont Residence, a young professional and graduate student residence dedicated to forming young men in human virtues and the interior life. Dr. Rhee is also co-founder, vice chair, and executive director of the Hippocratic Society, a community of physicians and trainees at chapters across the country, forming current and future clinicians in the practice and pursuit of good medicine. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rhee.
Hey everyone. Sorry I'm late. I left early from Boston, and then that thing happened where you're looking at the GPS, and then the time gets longer and longer and longer, and then you're like, oh no, but I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me to speak to Gina, Jim, and Ian. So the topic today that I thought I'd speak to you all about is about human flourishing and whether one can flourish at the end of life, and perhaps that it's a unique time for it. Most people don't question as to whether all of you are flourishing in the prime of your life as college students, though I'm sure sometimes it doesn't always feel like you're flourishing. But the question is, when physically one's body is shutting down, when one is confined to one's bed, whether one is actually flourishing. So as Gina mentioned, I'm currently a physician working in neuro-oncology, which is treating brain cancer patients, and also in palliative care. And palliative care, I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with it. I heard that a lot of you are nursing students, but it's a medical subspecialty that's focused on accompanying patients with serious terminal illnesses. Though hospice and palliative care comes from a long tradition where historically, when people had illnesses that were incurable, they would be taken care of for in the medieval times by convents, monasteries, helping people prepare well for death. And then the modern palliative care movement started as a medical subspecialty and integrated into medical science, thank you, which includes symptom management in physical, mental, and spiritual domains, and that owes its evangelization to Dr. Cicely Saunders, who was a woman who worked both as a social worker and nurse, and then eventually as a doctor. So I thought I'd start with telling you a bit about how I ended up in this field, which may shed light on why this particular topic is also one that I've been reflecting on deeply, and I'm continuing to do so. So it starts with where a lot of you guys are right now, sophomore year in college, where I guess I was a reflective sophomore, so I was reflecting on death and dying, and I had realized that I had a personal fear of death. And so confronted with that fear, I thought, what's a good way to get over this? I thought that volunteering for a hospice with dying patients would be where I could struggle and wrestle with this question. And while I was there, I saw how really good clinicians could guide, and this particular patient that I remember that we were speaking with, who hadn't spoken with his sister in 30 years. And the clinician expertly guided the patient into reflecting on what is most important to them. And then by the next time we had seen her, she had mended relationships with her brother and died peacefully 2 months later. So after that experience, I ended up applying to medical school, went to Mount Sinai, which is a major palliative care center. And the goal was to do palliative care, but while I was doing that, I did my rotation in neurology. And in neurology, there was a sense in which when patients lose a sense of memory or movement or speech, that it hits a deeper existential question of how that person defines themselves, and also how they relate to others. And so there seemed to be a very deep existential suffering there that I also wanted to meet. And so I ended up in neurology. And then neuro-oncology, because with brain tumors, there's a sense in which all of that is accelerated, right? A kind of quickening of the process of kind of loss of memory, cognition, and a lot of physical symptoms as well. And then I ended up coming full circle with palliative care. And so my current work focuses on the palliative care needs of patients with brain cancer, and specifically addressing their symptom and supportive care needs. And my hope is to improve the daily lived experiences of these patients and understand the way in which we could best support patients and their families through the most challenging moments in people's lives. So to start off the talk, let me start by sharing with you an anecdote. And so for confidentiality purposes, and to emphasize a particular point, I've brought together parts of cases from a few patients, from 3 different patients specifically. But just to paint the picture for you. So I walk into a room of a man in his 60s, and he is unfortunately suffering from pancreatic cancer. And pancreatic cancer is difficult because it is a form of cancer that is, one, incurable for the majority of the cases, and has a very high mortality rate, therefore, because it's usually diagnosed late stage. And the median overall survival is often less than a year from diagnosis. It's also challenging because people have a lot of symptoms. There's a lot of nausea, abdominal pain, bloating. Those just being a few of the symptoms that people have. And so walking in, I could already sense this heaviness by his expression as he was sitting in the chair. And I had been consulted for pain and for coping, given the team already knew that he was nearing the end of life. He was running out of options for chemotherapy. And so I sat in front of him, and let's call him Mr. M, and introduced myself. I asked him about his illness understanding, which is the typical thing that we do, his hopes and worries, and what is most important to him. So he tells me he's worked in many jobs throughout his life, ranging from construction to working at a warehouse to landscaping. But he shared with me that the job he felt most fulfilling was being a father, that his son causes and caused him a lot of strain because he had, quote, lost his way, and is mostly living in the basement, drinking and doing various drugs. But his daughter is a crown jewel of his life. She cares for him and his wife, who lives close by, stops by every day, has a family of her own, with 2 young children. So talking about his children, he starts to tear up. And at one point, he turns to me and asks, "Doctor, wouldn't it be better if I just died? I've been thinking about that option, that thing they call medical aid in dying. I just can't stand being a burden on my family, especially my daughter. She needs to care for herself, her own life. I sometimes think that it might be better if I just left them in peace." I want to take a pause there as I share the story of Mr. M to say that this is not an unusual sentiment. Being a physician working with patients at the end of life, I encounter many repeating themes, among them being human relationships always coming out at the top as patients share what is most important to them, and that the worry about family members, and that worry about how others will cope and go on after they die, even financially for the breadwinners of the family, often weighs heavily in their worries as they prepare for death and dying. I'll come back to Mr. M's story to share with you the next part of the conversation, but I wanted to start this off to give you context as to why the topic of flourishing, especially in illness, is so important. and why flourishing at the end of life specifically is worth deeper reflection, not only for the patients that many of you will be caring for, but also in our own journey of mortality, death and dying, as we prepare ourselves for what all humans experience at some point in our lives. I also want to reflect together on why Mr. M responded in the way that he did, and how it is reflective of a predominant erroneous idea of flourishing in our culture today. So we could start off by asking, what is human flourishing? In a certain sense, there's been a wide range of definitions in modernist literature, especially as there's been a recent resurgence in the focus of well-being, positive psychology, and this kind of YOLO, you only live once approach to living life, right? Well, we can go back to the initial comprehensive account of human flourishing from Aristotle. And Aristotle was concerned with flourishing for the same reason and question that perhaps many of you have reflected on. Questions like, what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to be human? And what is the end of being human? So I won't attempt to teach a whole semester's worth of material on flourishing in a 45-minute talk, but I think it's important to lay some groundwork in order to discuss flourishing in the context of the end of life. Because Aristotle says that the ultimate goal that we seek in life is happiness, or eudaimonia. The problem, though, lies in how we should live to find that happiness. He then goes on to distinguish 3 ways that human beings tend to have or follow that eudaimonia, or the passion of their souls. There's one who has a passion for fun or pleasure, another group who have a passion for honor or recognition, and then a third who have a passion for knowledge or wisdom or contemplation of higher things. I've always thought that this delineation was a good source of internal reflection, at least for myself. In looking closely at my interior motives and intentions, the person that I am today and the person that I want to be. In addition, Aristotle talks about this idea that happiness is not just a feeling or an emotion, but rather activity, or an actualization of our potentiality. And he also insists that flourishing doesn't consist in a possession of an external good, such as honors or wealth, and discounting that this second ruling passion be the ultimate source of happiness, or even on internal goods like health, but is synonymous with an activity of the human soul as human. Flourishing is activity, and the better we engage in the activity, the more it engages us to the core of our being and the fuller our flourishing. To bring this together, to live a life that is ethically and morally excellent, to live this inner activity, is a state of the soul. And that moral excellence is a matter of our heart. It is lived through our desires, our wishes, our intentions. And it is through our character, which is not our personality or temperament, but rather our power of choosing, our free will, our freedom of conscience, to shape the inner soul itself. And we develop character by habituation in choosing well, by repeated actions to choose the good. And so to summarize, and I hope not too succinctly, that Aristotle is commenting on what it means to be human by commenting on the telos of this question through the lens of eudaimonia. He sees the proper functioning of a human being is a rational activity in accord with virtue, and that flourishing for humans consists in excellent use of human reason, in pursuing moral excellence through choosing the good and molding one's heart to do so. So flourishing tracks this development of a living thing and has as its paradigm the healthy and vigorous biological development of an organism over time. And it's indexed to well-functioning of a living thing, and that well-functioning is something that is evidenced across the course of time rather than a particular moment in one's existence. Flourishing then as a concept is concerned with the whole life of an organism rather than a particular moment in the life of that organism. However, I think it makes sense when we reflect on our individual lives that there's a sense in which a particular context is also important in defining what flourishing looks like for an individual. Right? For example, what it means to flourish for an 8-year-old will look very different from what it means to flourish for a 33-year-old husband of 3 versus someone who is past retirement and into their mature years of 80. Therefore, there's a sense in which flourishing also has a contextual aspect, that flourishing can also be used to refer to specific time periods in a person's life or specific domains of one's life, and that there is a different emphasis on the most important goods that one pursues in different times in one's life. So that brings us back to, Mr. M. So as you may remember, we had left off with Mr. M asking if it were better to die in order to not be a burden on his daughter and family. So going back to that particular place and time, so I sit down next to him and we sit there in silence. After which I ask him, tell me more about that. It sounds to me like these relationships are really important to you. In response, Mr. M goes into how much he loves his daughter, how much he has loved to see her grow and develop into a mother, how she still has so much love for him, how she checks in on him so often, and how she loves to spend time with him. He also recognizes with her own children, she's been more busy. But despite this, she still finds time to make it over to visit him at least twice a week, even if it's for brief periods of time. I can't ask for a better daughter, he says, as he chokes through tears. So I'll take another pause there because I think it illustrates that in this contextual flourishing, end of life is not just one of many time points in one's life in which flourishing can happen. Rather, flourishing at the end of life has special importance. This is because the shape of the arc of one's life is important. And the habits of how one has lived in pursuit of the good is also critical. When lived well, the end of life can become a kind of fruition of one's final days. And of course, because the end of life brings with it suffering, and suffering itself can awaken us to deeper truths within ourselves. So I want to take a moment to emphasize a side point that's very important, that there may be some of you in this room, including some of you who chose nursing, because you've had personal experiences of death and dying and suffering. And so I just want to say that the purpose of this talk is not to romanticize terminal illness or dying, which can be extremely painful, and as a palliative care doctor, I witnessed that firsthand. However, the focus on this is to explore the commonly held and majority idea that flourishing is impossible at the end of life, and that there is no meaning or worth at all to suffering, and that we must eliminate suffering, even if it means eliminating the person in front of us. I was once on a panel with a famous bioethicist, or somebody asked me a question about a famous bioethicist, whom some of you may know, Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, who said famously that in 2014, in an article that he wrote in The Atlantic, that he hoped to die at 75, because he noted that living too long, quote, renders many of us, if not disabled, then faltering and declining, and robs us of our creativity and ability to contribute to work, society, the world, and leaves us feeble, ineffectual, even pathetic. This is the words of somebody with a very utilitarian worldview, which is the dominant view in our current culture, one whose worth is tied to how useful one can be. And this is because the predominant world philosophy in our modern times, it's important to consider whether this is a worldview that actually promotes the good, as well as in our various ethical frameworks, whether it is the one that best protects those who are vulnerable or in need of protection. It is therefore that reason that I present this talk in contrast to this utilitarian framework to address the concept of flourishing at the end of life and in illness and suffering, that we must transcend notions of usefulness or efficiency to deeper notions of the good, true, and beautiful, what we are made for and what we are meant to be. So returning to Mr. M, and I will say that every single one of my patients that I speak to at the end of life highlight two themes that are always important to them: relationships and a sense of meaning and purpose. And so going back to Aristotle's idea of this activity or energeia, as an important aspect of flourishing, Aristotle makes it clear that this activity is an activity of the soul. And in the end of life, when one may be physically debilitated and perhaps even confined to bed, there is still and can be an intense activity that is happening internally, of seeing that arc of one's life through the context of the meaning in which one has lived one's life, which is universally through relationships that one has formed. And so here I want to incorporate in one more modern scholar of Aristotle, Alasdair MacIntyre, who builds on Aristotle's understanding of what it means to be human by also drawing our lens to this idea of dependence and vulnerability as essential aspects of what it means to be human. He points out that humans are dependent at beings at all stages of life, most obviously in the beginning and end of life, but it would be naive to think that even at the prime of our lives, perhaps where many of you are, we do not depend on others for friendship, affection, mutual growth, and love. For MacIntyre, virtues are not just personal qualities, but are deeply connected to our roles in communities and ethical life, and involves understanding and fulfilling the obligations and responsibilities we have to others, and especially the vulnerable. So in order to illustrate MacIntyre's point, we return again to Mr. M, who just told us about how important his daughter is to him. He also goes on to tell me about his wife, who passed away a few years ago. And I also explore other important relationships in his life. Many of his friends have passed away since he's older, but he has those in his assisted living community who adore him, as well as his church community. So in order to reframe this utilitarian worldview, the idea that he should die because he is only a burden and cannot contribute physically, economically to his daughter's life, I say to him, you can still be a father to your daughter. You can still help her grow. Actually, in this time of illness and vulnerability, you give her an opportunity to live deeper the virtues of generosity, charity, a spirit of service. And this can also be a deeper time of growth for you, that in this state of vulnerability, of meekness, humility, sincerity, that it takes a lot of detachment, courage, and love to allow oneself to be taken care of. Suffering and illness are core to what it means to be human, and to explore this concept from a theological point of view would be a whole talk in and of itself. But suffices to say that one cannot have a full understanding of suffering and flourishing without considering what suffering is for, and whether we are preparing for what it means to flourish in the life that comes after. But this interplay of flourishing through virtue is made possible because of this idea of dependence and vulnerability. Aquinas speaks of this when he speaks about communicatio idiomatum. The specific context in which he speaks about this is referring to the sharing of attributes between divine and human nature of Christ, but it can also be applied metaphorically to the communicatio personarum of the marriage bond. And Aquinas speaks of the essence of marriage involving mutual giving of the spouses to each other, not just in terms of physical union, but in the totality of persons. And this personal, intimate union where spouses become one in a profound sense. And it's within that bond that all relationships are held, and it is through this bond that virtue can be shared and cultivated together. So I want to take a brief moment to expand on that last thought in a particularly difficult context. That perhaps you're thinking about what happens in patients who are intellectually or rather rationally severely diminished, or perhaps even unconscious due to their illness. They don't have this ability to perhaps reflect on their life, the arc of their life. And so what happens to those patients? Actually, it's very relevant to the work that I do because the most common malignant primary brain cancer that I treat is glioblastoma. And that is a grade 4 tumor, i.e. it's the most aggressive, and that it starts in the brain itself and is incurable. And by the time it's diagnosed and recognized, the median life expectancy is about 1.5 years. And the particularly challenging aspect of glioblastoma is that it's bimodal, in the sense that it happens in your 60s and 70s, but to a portion of patients that happens in the prime of life, in people's 20s and 30s. And so my research focuses on how to support patients through this cancer with an approach that helps them cope with a terminal illness that also affects their behavior, personality, and cognitive abilities as their nearing the end of life. And the reason I bring this up to you is that you may be thinking, well, this is all great, but what about the 95-year-old Mrs. K with end-stage Alzheimer's, or the 25-year-old Mr. B with severe intellectual disability with leukemia, or one of my patients, Mr. S, who has a primary brain tumor? What happens in cases where someone may not be able to make meaning, or perhaps even on the surface participate in these relationships at the end of life because of a severely diminished intellectual capacity, or even just consciousness or wakefulness? I think that's where this idea of communicatio idiomatum and communicatio personarum is helpful. Within these bonds of relationships that we form with one another, one can actually participate in the virtue of another. This is not only because virtues are pulled out of one another, as we spoke about in how Mr. M and his daughter still help one another grow in virtue, but also because within these bonds, these deep relationships, we become more and more like each other. In a theological sense, this is where Christians speak about the idea of becoming more and more identified with Christ as one develops a deeper bond with him. And in our personal relationships, this is where we become more and more like one another, as friends who love each other, grow in things that they love to do together, and where in marriage, spouses may even start to look like one another in old age due to the activation of mirror neurons and facial expressions that seem to converge over time. A close friend commented to me the other day of how he noticed that, maybe you notice I make these like hand gestures as I talk, but that he started talking with these hand gestures. And in a beautiful way, he used that to share with me how he really appreciates our friendship and respects our friendship, and that somehow even started gesturing the way that I do. I thought that it was a beautiful, vulnerable moment where he was showing me how much he appreciated our friendship by saying that rather than our very individualized culture where that would perhaps be seen as something embarrassing or somehow not making me the independent person that I am. But perhaps all of you have these experiences, right? We grow to love a certain hobby because our friend loves it, and we come to love it because we love him. Or we come to love certain experiences such as hiking, even if we didn't know we did before. We come to love it because she loves it, right? But even more deeply, we come to pursue the good and the beautiful that draws our friend, and this is the highest form of friendship, when we see and live our lives for the good that we also see in our friend. And then we start to share that good, and that is how friendship itself can transform the other into the life of pursuit of good and virtue, or perhaps the opposite, right? My younger brother, who he probably would hate that I'm using him as an example, but who, don't worry, he's like now a father of 3, assistant headmaster at a Catholic boys' school in Chicago, happily married. But he wasn't the most ordered guy in college. And after graduating, I worried about him a lot. But he went to live in this kind of teacher training program with this other guy, Jake, who was also in that program. And they lived together for 2 years. And I remember one Christmas he came home and he told me that he was reading Anna Karenina and working out every day, and I nearly fell out of my chair because if you knew my brother, like that's like he doesn't read. But so as opposed to those we know in our lives who fall into drugs or disorder or even to the point of failing out of school, when we surround ourselves with friends who pursue the good, we become like those we build bonds with, and also oppositely, who do not pursue the good, we also become like those we build bonds with. And so it's in these bonds, through living these bonds, that one can actually participate in the virtues of the other, through this communion with the other. And it emphasizes this deeper idea of our dependency and our interconnectedness, this sense in which we depend on each other even in the pursuit of the good, and one can still participate in that bond even if one were to become more intellectually diminished or unconscious. So in the patient with Alzheimer's who is hospitalized, there's this phenomenon called sundowning, who maybe some of you have seen. And this means that people can experience this syndrome called delirium, which is an acute state of confusion where one can get aggressive, paranoid, and not recognize those around them. And it's distressing to both the patient and those around him. However, the general understanding is that the patient always does much better when there is a loved one with him, because the loved one orients him. And in the context of delirium, even if there's a pathological neural signaling causing the agitation and paranoia, something about the bond still holds the person. Something about that bond transcends physical and pathological processes. We also see other analogical situations at the end of life in the form of what's called terminal lucidity, or even with vital sign changes. So a palliative care clinician knows this concept well, where there's this idea of a rally at the end of life, where a patient who has been unconscious or sedated the whole week suddenly, for reasons we cannot explain, seems to have a rally where they wake up, somehow timed with the arrival of a loved one, and is able to be nearly normal in terms of cognitive or physical functioning for a short period of time before they die. Now, this doesn't happen universally, but it happens frequently enough that palliative care physicians know that it happens. And this happened with Mr. M. When he gradually became sleepier and sleepier from his brain metastases, his family was constantly around his bed. And in the 24 hours before he passed, he suddenly woke up, was able to greet each one of his grandchildren, hugged and kissed his daughter, before he then went back into a state of unconsciousness and passed away. So even in the unconscious patient who does not wake up again, there is a mystery where the patient seems to hold on until his daughter arrived from California before passing, and that the bond may not be visible or even measurable, but those who work at the end of life still see the bond manifested frequently. So the end of life allows us to see our life in context, the story that has an arc. And in literature, it's like the hero's journey. I wish it need not have happened in my time, says Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. I always make a reference to Lord of the Rings because I'm a Lord of the Rings nerd, but Frodo has a happy life, but then this drama enters his life, right? The carrying of the Ring of Power. And he wishes it would not be entrusted to him, yet it has been, and he willingly takes on that burden. And that willingness to take on that burden of sacrifice changes everything for everyone in Middle-earth. But he only sees that, all of that, the meaning of that arc, the meaning of taking on the Ring of Power is analogous to the suffering that illness brings when he is leaving for the West in the end of the story. And in that sense, the end of life can be a time of intense meaning-making, a time of special importance where one ties the story together. And in that arc of the story of one's life, one consolidates the relationships, the virtues, forgiveness, generosity, love, as well as detachment as one prepares for leaving this current earthly life. And it's a time of intense flourishing in those domains of finding purpose and meaning, but it also has to be done willingly. And so I end here with 3 final thoughts, especially for those who are students in healthcare, but also for those here who have cared for loved ones who are dying. 1, both the existence of the bond, as well as the opportunities for terminal lucidity and the rally, as well as just how we ourselves may want to be treated at the end of life, emphasize the importance of treating the person at the end of life, whether awake or unconscious, with dignity in the true sense of the word. We can do this by always acknowledging the patient in the room, even if it is taking a moment to pause, speak to the patient even if he is unconscious, to touch and squeeze a patient's hand, to share comforting words that you are there, and that you will be there to accompany the patient through this time. And within that context, to re-examine our own view of personhood, that there is a mystery at the end of life that reveals to us the mystery of life itself, that there is something deeper than ability or functioning that defines what it means to be human. And exactly because of that, we have to do our best to be very human in our care of others, especially those who are vulnerable and those who may not have a voice to defend themselves. For if they did, they would say to us that they would want to be cared for in that loving way, in that particularly human way, in their particular condition, as we ourselves would want to be cared for. And we can only grow in these bonds with patients when I live my own bonds well in the little everyday things. So within that context, it may be helpful to reflect on how I live those bonds in college, with my relationships with my friends, but also how I practically live those bonds with those who depend on my love, but also those to whom I owe my love, to my parents, siblings. How can I always deepen my bond with others so that I could live a more meaningfully lived life? And when I also arrive at the end of life, I will reflect back, like all of my patients do, and see that my relationships are and were what was most important to me. 2, reflections on death should bring to mind for each one of us how I am living now, both on an individual level as well as a communal level. The pursuit of the good is not limited to the end of life. In fact, I can also say that patients often die how they lived. And though, of course, suffering offers an opportunity for deep conversion, for renewing of bonds, forgiveness, love, there is a small portion of patients who can never get over a deeply engraved hatred for themselves and for others. Those are the circumstances that are most challenging for a physician who works with patients at the end of life. When we live virtue daily in the little things, where we constantly purify our intentions, when we try to pursue the good by conforming our will to do that which is good, to not lie even in small matters, to live order by making my bed in the morning, to sacrifice my preferences for those of my friends when going out, to pay attention to the person who is isolated or alone, to call my parents frequently, maybe even daily, to show my love, to will to do my work well, not for ambition or honor or glory, but because working well in and of itself is good, to live a spirit of sacrifice and being truly present and attentive to our relationships. It is when we live these little things well, that we can then encounter those big things, the end of life, with the courage to still pursue the good. And if we do so, we come close to answering the question, what is this all for? For flourishing arguably is important at the end of life, but perhaps it is even more so just after death. And 3, lastly, in order to reflect deeply on life, one needs attention and a spirit of interior silence. And one needs a practice of dedicated silence, where one learns to grow in that silence. And part of growing in silence also means that one cannot always be in a rush, running from thing to thing to thing. And you also have to find times to slow down, to be present to the patient or the friend or the person in front of you. Or else you will never see and unlock the secrets of life, the deeper things that are beyond what is in front of you. But silence comes from attention, because it is in silence that we find our conscience speaking to us. And it is in silence that we find clarity. And it is in attention where love is manifested, as one feels loved when the person in front of us is truly attentive to us. And the most important thing in this life is love. So we could also ask ourselves, how do I live that attention? How do I live silence? And what are the intentional ways that I can grow deeper in silence and attention? Thank you. So if you'll allow me like 30 more seconds, I just want to show you one thing about the Hippocratic Society. So as Gina mentioned in the beginning, this is an organization that I helped co-found. And the idea is that it is a community of those entering into medicine, as well as those who are already in medicine, to help form them in virtue and character, and also the pursuit of what it means to practice good medicine. And so as part of that, we've built local chapters at medical schools across the country. We have about 6 now. And then we also have 2 undergraduate institutions at the University of Dallas and at Notre Dame. And the undergraduate ones are more focused on kind of the philosophy of medicine and discussing that with clinicians. And so if you are interested in hearing more about that, I think Providence would also be like a great place for us to think about that then I'd love to kind of engage with you as kind of students and also faculty on helping prepare those who are entering into the field of healthcare reflect more deeply on these ideas. So great.
So remember the rule. Student has to ask the first question. Make sure that I get to you with the microphone so that your words are captured and everyone can hear.
Thank you for taking the time to come down here for this talk. So towards the end there, you had mentioned that there are some people that are unable to resolve or let go of the hate for themselves and others. I don't really have a specific question regarding that, but is there anything you can say about that, such as what it's like to work with them, or why they might be like that, or why they're not able to move past that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing that I would like to comment on that is that I think it's very remarkable that it is so rare, in the sense that we come across people in our lives, maybe even on the street, where sometimes people seem very angry or hurtful, or just like read the news and sometimes we're like overwhelmed by what seems like the amount of evil out there. Yet I think that this end of life, this kind of process of detachment, the suffering does soften and also open people up to bigger questions outside of themselves. And so I find that it's actually very rare. And I guess as a physician was surprised by how rare it is where somebody like is so resistant at the end of life. Now, I can think of two particular instances that remain with me in my heart just because I find those instances particularly challenging. And in one case, it was it was a young kid. He was like in his 20s and was dying from a cancer and was just from like a very broken family and it didn't have the supports his whole life. And I think there was a sense in which if perhaps we had the ability to have more time with him, I think it would have been helpful. But also the context in which we were having discussions, because he was so young, was like always with other people in the room, from people in his family who also, speaking of these bonds, were not always most helpful for him to kind of live and speak about things in a way in which was also helpful for him. But I do think that that's why I talk about that particular idea of the little things of everyday life, because I do think that we often think those small decisions in our lives don't make a difference. But I think that when we come to the largest decisions in our lives towards the end of life, when we come to these decisions to accept suffering and or accept the illness in a sense that's purifying, we cannot do that unless we live these small decisions in our life every day well. And so I think the part of our role is to, do that for those around us, right? Of course, we could reflect on the idea of how a good society works and how the good of culture, we could mold that. I think it also comes down to how each one of us, with our relationships and our bonds around us, can then help our friends, our families to pursue the good in those small everyday things, so that when they arrive at the end of life, that they are able to then also kind of be in that state in which they could make those larger decisions. Yeah.
Floor is open.
Thank you for discussing something in it that is, I think everyone will come to the time when they'll be dealing with family at this situation. Do you see a generational change, or do you see generational changes in in how people prepare themselves for the end of life. You know, my grandparents were different than my parents, and I wondered if that's generational.
Yeah, one of the things that that I didn't go too much into the talk is how much practice of tradition helps to provide a sense of security for people at the end of life. And I think with a sense of rejection of tradition, I do think that generally that makes things more difficult, especially among people who are, well, myself included, I'm not that old, but of the younger generation, where there's a sense in which the practices of tradition and the traditions that are built around one's whole life give that sense of security. And I do think that that is one of the challenges, especially I think, and perhaps some of you have seen this before even, where a patient, with severe Alzheimer's, who doesn't really seem to be interacting at the end of life, the daughter comes into the room and starts praying, for example, the rosary out loud, and she like repeats with her, right? There's something about that tradition that grounds the patient, and I would say creates a sense in which the patient can non-cognitively progress towards the end of life in a way that still helps them kind of grow, again, in a non-cognitive way. I think in medicine, in modern medicine especially, with this very biological approach to the person, we don't really accept things that we don't understand or can fully explain biologically. But I also would say that there are many times where, you see a family member coming into a room holding the hand of somebody who is unconscious, and their vital signs improve. And so there's a sense in which there are kind of ways in which we could help people kind of come closer to terms with the end of life. And I think that these, but medicine has only kind of cognitive ways of doing it, like helping people reflect on the meaning of their life or the arc of their life. But I do think that that's an area, and it's an area that I'm interested in developing in my research to better understand, what are kind of these non-cognitive approaches, including the structures of tradition, that could then help people kind of encounter that better, especially when they have kind of diminished cognition or even unconscious. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for coming. I was very eager to hear this, and it was really quite wonderful. As you know, we have a nursing school now, and I thought maybe to ask you to reflect on the difference between the care that a nurse gives and the doctor. A couple of years ago, I heard something, I think it's true, but you could tell me, that the patient or the patient's family look to the doctor to save the person. And they look to the nurse to care for the person. And at the end of the life, and to be honest, I was just with my mother last week and was at that last stage with dementia. And I was so struck by, and it's been going on for a year or two, so continually struck by the fact that the nurses who've never really known my mother, like I knew my mother, because she came into a ward of dementia, right? So she never really has been able to respond to them, except early on she could smile and that kind of thing. But that passed as the dementia began to deepen. But they cared for her, right? They cared for her despite the fact, and loved her, despite the fact that she cannot love them back. And that seems to be sort of a unique calling for the caregiver, to care for someone who cannot give the typical things that one does to build a relationship of care and love.
Yeah. I don't know if I have too much to comment on that because I think that's all right. um, and medicine and nursing kind of as a branching point. In a certain sense, there was a bit of an artificial sense where nursing became about caring, and doctoring became about diagnostics and treatment. And I think with that, the doctor has kind of outsourced the caring to the nurse, which is clearly wrong. In a certain sense, I think palliative care actually, because of the fact that Cicely Saunders was a social worker, nurse, and a doctor, is a movement, at least that I see in medicine, to try to reclaim that which is core to medicine, which is the care of the person in front of us. And I think that the nurses especially have as part of a core aspect of the nursing profession itself, is about the care of the patient and not having to kind of worry about the kind of questions of diagnostics or treatment and just be and accompany the patient. I often feel that way that when I'm practicing palliative care, because my work is to like be present with the patient and accompany them in the suffering. Now, I think that perhaps because of that, nursing, and these are just, I think, things to be aware of, that can also fall into sometimes this checkbox mentality. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of forces in healthcare, and we know that the end that we're pursuing is the care of the person, yet you have many things to do. And so you are a good nurse if you like bathe the patient once a shift, like you like gave them the medication, you like did the delirium assessment, you did the neuro exam. And there's many, 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 many things to do, and then many, many things to document. And so you could erroneously, in a unreflected life or a less reflected life, think that you are being a good nurse by checking off many, many boxes efficiently, and therefore lose a sense of what you are doing things for. I think that in that way, we all have experiences of nurses who are just really, really good, and perhaps occasional instances of nurses who just feel so hardened. And I think that that's what happens to the nurse who feels hardened, is that there is a sense in which they lost the end goal, the person who is the person in front of them, and has seen it more as a checkbox or efficiency mentality. I think the other thing that nursing can be a danger in nursing is that because of this draw, this deep draw to care for and accompany the suffering person in front of them, the nurse has to have a really grounded understanding of what the good is for the patient. Because I've also seen cases where out of that sense of compassion, the nurse may want to like end suffering by hastening death. And I think that that is also the great danger, perhaps, with nursing, because of this sense in which if we don't understand fully the meaning of compassion and the care of the person and the good of the person, then we could sometimes our own feelings and emotions can get in the way of like helping the patient pursue that good. So I guess I'm not sure if that answers your question, but those are at least the reflections that I have from that. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your comments today. I share your Tolkien love and nerding. I wonder if you could, it seems to me that your work brings you, into a tension that exists implicitly in our culture, which is about freedom. Ultimately, our death, nobody's getting out of here alive, so this is not a choice, right? But ultimately, as you talk about the practice of living well, it's an exercise of our freedom and how important that might be at the end of life, which is not the popular conception of freedom, which is freedom from constraint in some ways, but really the capacity to dispose of ourselves toward what we value. And so when we meet the end of our life, it's the ultimate act of freedom to releasing myself into the the freedom of my freedom, who is, at the end of it, God. So I wonder if you might reflect a little bit about the freedom with which you see people meeting their end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's like a very reflective question. I think that oftentimes we think about freedom in the context of autonomy, and we think about that as through the lens of a very individualistic understanding of autonomy. And I think that this is where a McIntyrean approach is very helpful, because it would be, I think, naive to think that our decisions are unrelated to the decisions of others. And what I mean by that, or even the states of others, and what I mean by that is, let's maybe take the case of a child with a severe intellectual disability or Down syndrome, right? There's a sense in which there is through the pathology, a restriction of their kind of ability to make choices. And so they depend on their caretakers to help them make decisions. And the better the caretaker helps that form that boy or the girl in the understanding of the good, in the pursuit of the good, so that it becomes easy to make that decision, there is a sense in which that freedom is shared, right? Those decisions are shared. And I think that it is naive to think that doesn't happen to any of us, that all of our decisions are actually decisions that we make in the context of these bonds and these relationships, whether we would like to think that we are making completely autonomous decisions. And I feel like that's the main kind of unspoken, and I am a little bit worried about saying this out loud to make sure that it's not taken out of context. But when we have these discussions about assisted suicide and euthanasia, what is often not spoken about, I think, is what did your family feel about that when you made that decision, right? And I am certain that no family member truly wants to lose you prematurely, right? Out of this idea of a free decision. And of course, because of this erroneous idea of freedom, there's a sense in which the family wants to support the patient and says, like, you do whatever you think is good for you. But I think that itself is also a mistaken understanding of freedom, because our freedom takes into account that which is the decisions of also those we love, and especially those we are the closest with, like those who love us and we love the most. And so I think at the end of life, it's true. I think there's a little bit of also an irony there, because by this kind of autonomous decision to end one's life, actually you end all ability to make any decisions, autonomous decisions. So there's actually an abolishing of freedom there, or autonomy, I would say. But I think that in the most important decision in one's life, we could come back to this idea of the internal activity of Aristotle, this sense in which this energeia that happens at the end of life, where so much can happen at the end of life in terms of the working intensely of the growing of bonds of relationships, that you could live for years and years and maybe not have the same intense days that you have with your brother at the end of life. And it's just, that's the fact, because that's like what happens when you know time is limited, that you want to really wring every single moment out. And so to, I think, ignore the fact that, or to lay it aside, I think it is a great tragedy to think that there is like a sense in which freedom then is equated to not love, but rather this ability to make an independent decision. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for coming down here, especially from Boston. I can only imagine the traffic. So I found it interesting that you specialize in both neuro-oncology and end-of-life care. I feel it's kind of an association of a lot more of a clinical biological perspective with something like neuro-oncology, and then a bit more humanistic with end-of-life care. Did you find, with all the training that you've had, was there a bit of a learning curve with end-of-life care that, something that's not covered in all your training? I think kind of what comes to mind is humans are so broad, especially human behavior, especially end-of-life behavior. What kind of obstacles did you have to overcome with learning something like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. Part of that answer, I would say, is similar to the answer that I gave before regarding this idea of the checklist mentality. I think that one in healthcare can be pulled into this idea of being rewarded for being efficient rather than doing that which is good for the patient. So I reflected on that a lot during the palliative care training. But I think the other thing that was interesting was, in neuro-oncology, I would sometimes do these crazy calls where, like, in neurology, for example, we would do like a 28-hour shift every 4 days and work normally the other days, and still be expected to like function as a normal human being, And in neuro-oncology, like, it was even sometimes worse, where I would be on call for a week at a time, like, so 24/7 call for a week at a time, and I don't know how I did it, but I mean, somehow we all did it, I guess. But I found that in palliative care, the thing that was different was in neurology and neuro-oncology, I was able to still like go in and function as a doctor. Even if I was sleep deprived, I was still able to like kind of do and diagnose and kind of go with, I guess, adrenaline too. But there was a sense in which if I didn't get like my at least full 7 hours, preferably 7.5 hours of sleep in palliative care, that I couldn't be truly present to the patient in front of me. And so I took a lot of care in making sure that like I was well rested, or else at least that I could be, in order to be present, because there's like a real intensity to being present to somebody, fully present to somebody, that I think is what I learned during that year, because you could be present as a doctor, but when somebody is trying to tell you like the most important things to them, and then you're helping them make a decision about their end-of-life care, you have to try to absorb as much as possible, including not just what they're saying, but a lot of things that are unsaid, that are reading between the lines of what is this patient actually trying to tell me. And so I do a lot of explaining back to patients and saying, what I heard you say is this, where I add in a sense in which I've read more than what they've said. And that requires a lot of attention. And I briefly talked about this idea of attention, which I think is a really beautiful idea, because attention actually is about your will. It's about enacting your will. And therefore, attention, I think, is the greatest act of love. Because when you're sitting in front of a person and you give their full attention, your full attention, there is a sense in which the person knows that you're giving them your full attention. And it requires a lot of willpower not to think about your assignment, not to think about your worries, not to think about other things that often creep in when even we're talking with our friend or whatever, right? Where we could be always part present, or at least not fully present. And I think there's something really interesting about that, because there's this also idea where oftentimes we interpret mindfulness, which I think is popular these days, as an emptying of our mind. Or perhaps one can even say prayer as just like a time for nothingness. But actually, I would say is a time, or should be a time, for very intense attention. And that is why things like study and attention to your study and doing it very well with attention directly translates into not only attention for your relationships in your loved ones and your friendships, because when you practice attention in your work and study, you're practicing that, and it always necessarily has to then apply to the attention in other parts of your life. And that's why I think this idea of attention is so important, and I think that that's why in today's society we often find that it's hard to create friendships, it's hard to create kind of these relationships or bonds, because everything in society is like trying to pull our attention or scatter our attention. especially our phones, but I think many other things. And so I think also this idea of attention was something that I reflected a lot on that year and that I try really hard. And perhaps that was actually like a pretty big difference that I felt between what I was doing before and what I'm doing now.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm so grateful. It was just amazing.
Thank you.
I'm sure it unearthed for a lot of people in this room all kinds of experiences and things into the future. My question is that, well, it's a question, but it's also a comment. I've had 3 experiences with people who have died in palliative care, but it wasn't a natural death. They just kept giving them morphine even when they were just laying there and there was nothing wrong with them.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of shocking on different levels, on all different levels at different times. It seems to me that you have a vocation and a mission that's from God. He's sending you out to educate people in the way that you think, in the way that you present yourself. Could you talk about that for a little bit, especially with the people who are entering into that field? And we're all entering into it with you because we're going to die, and we also have loved ones who are dying.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could just talk about your experience of God and how He's brought you to this and how you intend to give that to others, that would be a very good thing, I think, to understand for all of us here.
Yeah, thank you for that question. This is part of, it's kind of nice because it ties back into this slide on the screen, which is that this is actually the main work that we're trying to do in the Hippocratic Society, because modern medicine and also nursing has oftentimes divorced morality or moral formation from education. And so education has become about knowledge rather than wisdom, and that there is a aversion to the fact that the moral formation of somebody is intrinsic to the work that we do, especially in medicine and nursing where we are caring for another human person. Now, the problem with divorcing that is that you also remove then formation in virtues, especially the virtue of prudence, which is, I think, what you are also touching on, which is that all healthcare clinicians need to know how to treat the person with this mother of virtues, with prudence, right? And so if you are treating a person in front of you and you see that they are in pain, of course it's good to treat them with a medication that treats their pain. Now, the part of prudence that comes into play there is this aspect of, okay, I'm going to give them enough pain medication to knock them out, or am I going to give them pain medication to relieve their pain, but then perhaps allow them to interact and speak with their family, or underdosing, which typically we don't do, is more like a dose finding thing. But there's a sense in which there's a wide latitude of prudence that one needs when practicing the art of caring for another human being, right? And I think that with the removal of that moral aspect of our formation, we have lost a lot in terms of forming people in how to live prudential judgment, which is so important in our ability to care for other human beings. And so I see that often because of the fact that we are not forming people in the virtues of prudence, of integrity, of humility, of these things that are so important and central to the practice of medicine, but that somehow we have kind of seen that or moved that as moralistic, and therefore doesn't belong in the kind of modern educational system. And so part of the work that we are trying to do here is to both help those who are entering this field to develop prudence, and development of prudence also involves experience, right? And so part of what we're doing in the Hippocratic Society is to create communities of people coming together over dinner, discussing, and through good role models who are trying to pursue the good in medicine, in healthcare, to then impart that experience to those who are entering training, because both doctoring and nursing are very apprenticeship-like models. Like you go and you like are with people, you see how people do and treat patients, and that's how you learn how to treat and how to take care of others, right? And if you have bad role models, unfortunately, like that is what happens. You like follow bad role models. And so therefore we have to also highlight good role models who can help those reflect more deeply on what it means to find that, that judgment in treating patients. That is so important, and especially important at the end of life when each of those decisions are even more magnified. I think we see this a lot in, I would say, in oncology, where as a palliative care doctor, sometimes you're working with a patient with pancreatic cancer, and you see that you have a family meeting because somehow like everybody on the healthcare team like knows this patient is dying. But then you have a family meeting, and the family is there, and the oncologist says, well, like we could do one more line of therapy. And then you're like, why did you say that? Because like that that line of therapy is not going to help this patient live longer. Like it's only going to give them, and it's hard because then everybody on the healthcare team knows what is not being said, but then the family has a different understanding and thinks that this treatment is then the silver bullet, which I think is again an example of how when you don't build this moral formation of prudence, in that oncologist, there's an imbalance of kind of compassion, perhaps also this inability to face the courage to face what should be said, right? There are many virtues that are playing in that space, right? Of being able to then guide the patient so that they could pass in a way in which they are able to do that work at the end of life, right? And I think that is what is dramatically or dearly needed in medicine, is that reuptake of the importance of that part of the formation, which is what we're trying to do. And then also doing that by kind of creating these role models who could then guide people to be able to practice that well. Yeah.
Please join me in giving a warm round of applause to Dr. Rhee.
Thank you.